Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. I am your host, Tracy Stuckrath, and you are here eating at a meeting, and we are live here every Wednesday. And I am excited to have on the show today this gentleman right here, Andrew Hartley, who is the Senior Vice President at CBRE Hotels Advisory. He's got 12 years of hospitality experience starting in food and beverage operations, which he then morphed into operations and real estate consulting on hotels, resorts, event centers, and other complexes globally, nationally and globally. Saw your report that came out in December, your Hotel Horizons, is that right? Forecast.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep. That was all about the lag in food and beverage recovery at U.S. hotels.
Yeah, we took a kind of a special interest into discussing what's happening in the food and beverage scene. I mean, typically our Hotel Horizons forecast is primarily driven with the occupancy and ADR within the marketplace. And then we have our subset of trends data where we put in an annual report on overall departmental revenues, including F&B and everything. But we decided to do a special one to see, because we know there's some interesting things happening in that space. So we add on some additional insight into where we think 2022 was going at the time. And we're probably still on track but now that 2022 is past.
So tell us about some of those trends that you did see. I mean, there's a lot of jargon that I, as a meeting planner, don't read every single day, but it kind of really relates. Hotels can read it really well, but can you tell us what you've seen and then maybe put it in layman's terms for meeting planners?
Yeah. So I think this will come probably as no surprise for most of the meeting planners and out there that, you know, coming out of the pandemic, starting about mid-year 2021, we definitely saw from at least a demand side on the occupied rooms for hotels, a huge influx of the social groups, especially the weddings, the galas, the reunions or whatever, even some of the state associations that basically were pent up by being canceled for, you know, a year and a half. They just were all coming in at a mad rush. And I know it's definitely the meeting planners that we spoke with and the sales associates we spoke with on property. And that it was just it was just a very aggressive return of that type of social function. And that also was in line with the leisure increase in the market as well. While leisure travelers were getting sick of staying put, they were just going to stay at any hotel practically. And they were driving to anything they could that was an experience, that was fun, that was a destination. And all of that kind of coincided together. But the one thing that's still driving a lag in the F&B department, you know, when we speak F&B, we're kind of talking about the all-encompassing F&B picture of the food and beverage. So we're looking at both room rentals, banquets that drives F&B, as well as the on-site amenities and outlets of the restaurants and the lounges on the property. But the two components that are still lacking as we're going into 2022 and as we finish 2022 is we're still not yet to pre-pandemic levels of business travel, and that includes business group travel. And that's one of the challenges. While business group travel is returning and we're seeing more bookings here and there, the volume is still not quite there. A lot of the impacts from that could definitely be attributed to, you know, you could say the work from home environment's a big factor because now there's a less centralized workforce that may be using some of that conferencing space. And there's a really interesting point to that. Some properties are benefiting from that structure they're actually gaining business conferences that they never had before. And think of it like maybe a resort property. I spoke to a sales associate on a property that was more of a destination resort. It was a drive-through destination. And one of the interesting tidbits that they had that I thought was really compelling was that they were getting groups that were usually going to the downtown core urban sector historically because that's where the offices were. Most of their employees are housed somewhere close by. And it just made sense have those events there. And then when the employment set basically started working from home and some of the employees moved further out to get cheaper housing or have a more desirable location to live, then they said, okay, well, we no longer have office space. So they've allocated some of that expenditure to having more frequent conferences, but at a destination rather than a core urban sector that supports their business. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And it kind of lended itself more towards the resort style property of gaining business that they just didn't have before. So I thought that was an interesting little green shoot, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and then I remember talking to a property in Orlando, kind of on iDrive, and who was getting a lot of smaller pieces of business or mid-sized pieces of business that normally couldn't fit in the property because of all of the big convention property, or events that were happening. So they finally got to use this property that they've been wanting to. And so they actually found a whole new market. It'll be interesting to see what happens when big conventions come back and what happens in that business for them.
No, I completely agree. I do, in talking with some of the more convention and conference oriented hotels, they are definitely having a challenge with the large group events coming in on a frequent basis. I mean, and also depends on the region. I mean, it's the appetite of whatever geopolitical issues of that region are. Some of them, state associations are coming back in full force, which is a big driver of large conventions. And some of them, they're just not as aggressive as they were before. Or they're looking at more diverse locations because of people discovering some certain properties here and there. But yeah, I mean, it's a really good point that I've had similar discussions with, especially some of the suburban, just in a business sector conference or convention hotel where they just had to diversify. And at one point, I think you mentioned the article. So at one point, these were mainly business and convention oriented hotels. Now they're selling more groups on the weekends because that's who's coming in. So now we're getting the social groups, the smaller functions, and it still poses a challenge, and it's not really ideal because that property isn't really built to suit that on a long-term basis. But it'd be interesting. You're right. It's interesting to see where that is headed.
So what are the things that have been attributing to the lag in food and beverage? I mean, I can only assume that it's staffing, challenges and staffing issues, no matter where your property is located. Food and beverage costs, is that helping? What are those two things and then other things that are attributing to the lag?
If we want to talk about it from the demand side, we've already discussed briefly that we're missing some major demand segments to drive a full return to food and beverage. As you talk about the whole, we need more business travelers, we need more business conferences. Now on the revenue side and the income side and the expense side, I mean, it's hard to staff right now for a full event. It's really hard to staff for permanent full-time employees because your book of business at a hotel is now no longer standard. You don't have that constant base of demand that you've always had. Like, the market has shifted a lot of locations, especially downtown urban core locations where I think some locations still don't even have a corporate negotiated rate yet because it's just, there's not any corporate demand yet. It's coming back slowly, and now they're kind of getting on a case-by-case basis. But that solid base of 3 to 5 days of here's our corporate traveler, and then the weekends we get some of the leisure traveler. But generally, we're averaging each week at 72% occupancy. So you know what to staff up, especially in a high cost department, which is F&B. And, the first thing when the pandemic started, the first kind of penny to drop was F&B. It was the first thing that you just completely didn't need staff for because that is the most costliest department to operate that yields the least amount of revenue of your two major revenues. So the minute you're not getting heads and beds, they cut all F&B. Now we're not exactly getting a consistent heads and beds scenario where managers or operators are knowing what to expect as far as the weeks come. So it's really hard to staff in that situation. And while banquets, you can use staffing agencies and whatnot and outsource most of your labor on any given big event, you still kind of need a core FTE to help make sure everything runs to the correct service standards.
All right, what's an FTE?
Full-time employee. Sorry.
Okay.
You still need a full-time employee, you still need full-time employees to basically make sure the clock is running. Because if it's not, and you're relying only on outsourced labor, that becomes a challenge for especially if you're looking in the upper upscale luxury quality properties, you really need to make sure your service standards are up. And it's definitely a challenge in the operated food and beverage departments, the restaurants, the lounges. Those ones are very challenging to staff up because you're not getting a consistent demand base day to day that's reliable at this point.
Right.
I mean, it's looking better. Every month looks better than the previous month. So slowly getting there. It's just all about, well, when do we finally normalize?
Yeah. Well, it just reminds me of going to a very high-end property in Boston. I think it was in 2021, and my client had negotiated a meeting room space, and there was nothing open in the property except the casino on the backside. I mean, the only place I could eat was the sundry shop, and even the front desk. It said, please call ahead to let us know that you're arriving so the front desk person can come out. So there was very limited full-time staff, let alone any kind of part-time staff.
Yeah. I mean, we actually wrote another article about this maybe a year ago, but, basically we were saying, well, we used to assume certain fixed costs associated with a hotel, and we have average numbers like rooms fixed costs is maybe 70% or 30% or something like that, or F&B. But we've basically discovered because of the pandemic, hotels are almost a 99% variable cost. Because if there's a position that needs to be cut because they're not getting enough demand, they'll cut it. And at the end of the day, the GMs and sales managers quickly learned that you've got to be a jack of all trades if you still want to work on property. And that's when you start that, we definitely saw the depth of where the GM would be running, doing maybe a food prep area for boxed lunches or, during the pandemic. At the same time, they'd be cleaning a room. At the same time, they'd be selling a group. So basically, we really saw how skeleton crew a hotel could get. And that experience you had is a testament to that. And you mentioned Boston, and there's always a labor risk for the owners and operators of the union environment. And sometimes because of the cost of a union labor, it's really not a wage issue. It's more about the number of required people to have on staff. In some cases, it made more sense to just not open F&B because we would have had to fully staff up for people that aren't there or have positions that we just don't need. So there was a lot of pressure to just, if we could and get around, and if they were trying to get around some sort of union issue, if the answer was we just keep that department closed and lower our room count of inventory, then we can, skirt by. Because of the pandemic, there's been a lot more renegotiations of labor contracts too. So,
well, and not speaking of hotel, but the convention center in Orlando just renegotiated with its servers there. So they're getting $18 an hour, food and beverage staff through Sodexo. Well, and you were talking about general managers doing a bunch of things. There was a property in Dallas that I was talking to during the middle of the pandemic that the general manager, the vice president of sales, and the front desk person all went and got their food handler certifications, and they hired an outside caterer to do the catering, but they were the ones serving it.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, we could go on and on about the crazy stories that happened during the pandemic because there's just so many interesting tidbits. And, I think, now, luckily that demand's returning, you're starting to see some of those GMs and sales associates or whoever was basically, for lack of a better term, left on property. Now they're starting to get some breathing room because while the hotel was slow, they were running around like crazy, just trying to keep the lights on.
Right.
And now, but the challenge, as you put it, back to the initial conversation, is now with inflation and everything, and employment we're practically at full employment nationally and even at most local levels. It is very difficult and was already a challenge prior to the pandemic. And now it's even worse trying to staff up, especially in the hotel industry, which tends to rely on low wage labor. And that poses as a major problem for both service standards and maintaining reasonable pricing on events. I'm fairly positive that events pricing is increasing aggressively, especially the food portion of. You see it non-hotel related. If anyone's been ordering food for the past 3 years, they've noticed a major difference in how much, say, an order of pad thai cost 3 years ago and what it costs now is a huge difference. Right. Yeah. Just from a restaurant perspective, now if you're looking at that from a hotel perspective, it's going to be, the prices are going to be higher, and that's can be driven by multiple facets, whether that's the increase in employment wages, as well as the increase in food costs, which those are all risks. But
they are. I mean, the price of coffee, and I've talked about this last week or the week before, the price of coffee. One planner has got, inclusive of tax and gratuities, paying $250 something per. And that, I mean, that just seems ridiculous. And my guest last week is like, all these planners need to push back and say, we're not paying that. But it's hard to do when you're, this is where you've got to go. And one of my clients is like, talking about different standards they want to uphold for their meetings, but they have to go to this property. Where is the cut line, right? You don't know what to negotiate because this is where you have to go because it's the only space you can find at the moment.
Right. Yeah. That's a big problem that, especially if there's, even in some of the areas like New York and Boston, where there's still some hotels that are just closed, or at least they have a partial inventory closed, or they just won't take any groups for right now, just because they've just, got, 600, 800 rooms. They're like, we don't need that right now. So we're not going to take big groups unless it's on a consistent basis. So, if you've got a meeting planner, they're just stuck at a property. Yeah, there is, as a person who works in the hotel space, I don't want to say there's price gouging, as indicated by that previous guest, the conversation you may have had. I do think that as of right now, the hotel industry's lost an exorbitant amount of capital. And because of that, there's definitely a lot of a correction that's going to come in place in pricing. Inflation is obviously a huge driving factor of the cost of goods and also the labor expectations. The hotels will always try to maintain a certain margin. F&B is a high expense margin department. You're lucky to come out alive of F&B at paying 70% towards all your expenses of F&B. That's a best case scenario. That's a average best case scenario. I mean, some properties can do like 50% profit margin, but if you get 70%, you're fine. You're basically at industry standards, and they're always going to try to get there. So if that means the chicken plate's no longer $16 a plate, now it's $25 a plate, that may be the new norm.
Right.
And
or you're adding,
or they're not even offering the chicken plate. I've actually talked about that. At this point, we're not going to offer that. We're going to only offer Russian style service or whatever with the shrimp and filet. So, that's it. That's all we have. We're not going to offer the chicken because they'd rather do better profit margin items.
Okay. Well, and then they're also, I'm hearing from lots of planners too, is like, well, you have this fee and then you have this additional fee and then you have this additional fee, even if you want to just book it. So it's not just the service charge and the tax. There's, even though I'm supposed to get free room rental, I'm actually being charged room rental or this additional fee.
I'll take my hat off. So at one point I did F&B operations, food and beverage and banquets at a full service hotel and also in fine dining in New York for a while. And at that time, yes, a lot of times the room, once you're basically covered a certain amount in food, then room rental was usually accustomed. And the reality is they want the rooms, the actual booking of hotel rooms, right? As long as you've got a block of 50 rooms and you're paying for the food, sure, you can have the event space, or maybe we'll charge $100 for it or some sort of nominal fee. As of right now, again, if sales associates are trying to find creative ways to increase revenue in that department, room rentals may be more common. Maybe that's because there's less room blocks in the deal. So the shifting of where that revenue is being covered then has to come more on the food and beverage side. If it's a smaller group, you're probably more likely to have to pay for a room rental. Now, I'm not an operator anymore, so I haven't been having to get this creative. I just learned from listening to what other operators say when it comes to exactly how they're selling the package. I look at the package as a whole and where are the revenues tracking. So
just before we got on, we were talking about properties that, and in your report, you talk about this too, is finding new avenues for food and beverage, which building a rooftop bar or things like that. And some properties that aren't understanding that it's an added value to them. Can you talk through that and what you talked about in the report a little bit?
So where I work, I'm a food and beverage nut. It's always my passion in the hotel space. And so before COVID, there was definitely a trend. And a lot of this was driven by numerous facets. And whether it was driven by an almost oversaturation of branded hotels, you've got so many Marriotts, you've got so many Hiltons, you've got so many Hyatts, so many Wyndhams, whatever, that all the brands trying to create these different sub-brands that would identify in a different way and have different concepting. And one of the driving forces of that was we're changing the food and beverage experience drastically to try to accommodate a new source of demand or differentiate this hotel from that. You could say a prime example is maybe the Moxie concept. If you were to just take the rooms in a Moxie hotel, which is a Marriott, if you were to just take the rooms, it's a micro-sized 200 square foot room. It's smaller than a Hampton Inn room. Generally, it's able to charge a higher rate, primarily because it has most of the properties, they have a pretty good food and beverage option, and it's usually experience driven. It's got like arcades in there, or it's got pool tables set up. And when you enter and check into the property, you're not checking in at a front desk, you're checking in maybe at the bar, right? So the whole experience is centered around the way F&B is defining this concept, and it's uplifting the rate. So the room may not be as nice as what you would get in a standard limited service room, but they've escalated their brand value and their concept to allow a higher room rate by using food and beverage to do that. So this is a term we use a lot, that owners always consider food and beverage in a hotel as it's kind of the redhead stepchild, or it's the necessary evil, and it's something that tends to lose money more than make money. But as long as they understand that with new concepts comes an indirect effect to your overall room rate, then that's where an owner or an operator could potentially see a true ROI. And these new brands are answering that, these new concepts and these new independent hotels that are saying, well, I'm going to shoot for a 50% of all my revenues are going to be F&B, whether that's groups, whether that's a specific restaurant or whatever concept that I have. I really want to drive an F&B experience at this hotel. Now, most traditional hotel operators are like, well, why would you do that? Because now you just increased all your expenses way more, and your hotel is a hell of a lot less efficient. So, but it's proven to be a very good concept and operation going into the pandemic. Now, coming out of the pandemic, I would argue that a lot of those properties that had that experiential food and beverage concepting behind them are faring better than the ones that don't. So if you've got those full service Hilton Convention Center hotels that have, here's our restaurant space, here's maybe our bar lounge area, which we've renovated to then be included in the main lounge, so it's still more of an experience, but we're still kind of very traditionally set up and everyone knows what to expect. And maybe here's our cafe, and then we've got the groups of meetings. Well, they still rely on groups of meetings to drive all of that. They don't rely on local traffic. They don't rely on leisure travelers wanting to experience the property. So because of that, they're at a higher risk of returning quickly versus the Canopy of the world, or the AC Marriott, or other property that is a smaller size property that has a larger food and beverage footprint that is well concepted to fit either the local destination. It's got maybe some of them even have a signature chef that did the menu for them, or a signature food operator like some of the properties in New York have. They're faring better because the overall experience on property was better for the leisure traveler who's king right now.
Right.
So I would say the pandemic is probably exasperating the advantage of that type of food and beverage concepting.
Right. Because even like staying in an embassy, versus a loft, right? I mean, that's a completely different experience. The food and beverage offering in that a loft is a much different experience than what you experience in an Embassy Suites or even a Hyatt Place. I mean, Hyatt Place, I think, has elevated itself a little bit, but still, a loft is, I think, you have a different experience based on that food and beverage concept.
Absolutely. And that's a really good comparison you make, because especially in suburban America, Embassy Suites was king, especially with the meeting planners, because it was like everyone got what they wanted. They got a large room, 400 square feet, it's 2 rooms, so a separate bedroom, and you can fit 5 in there, 6 in there. It doesn't really matter. Or you could have people who want to bring their families, whatever. And you sold, and they got maybe $50 or $60 greater average rate than the closest hotel. And then they'd have enough meeting space to hold meetings. And then they had the whole free breakfast. That was a good quality free breakfast with an egg omelet station and all those types of amenities. And they had a bar. Places like the Aloft, which was kind of one of the first of the sort of limited service hotels with an elevated food and beverage experience, kind of streamlined the overall brand by adding a unique food and beverage package, which honestly is probably, if you just take the nuts and bolts of it, isn't that much better or worse than an Embassy. In fact, I would argue it's probably worse because their kitchen only is convection ovens. They don't have a grill. So their food options are limited, but the minute you walk in, there's the bar, get a beer, or for breakfast, there's a grab and go station that has decently fresh cooked meals out of a convection source, or they've got already fresh made salads you can go and pick up. So it's really beneficial to, in some cases, the leisure traveler who's just wanting to unwind either after a days of events, which means there's a pool table and a bar right there, easy. I'm not surrounded by a mass of people because it's a smaller property. I'm not in a huge 500 room Embassy Suites. I'm in a 120 room, a loft. And so that definitely brought up the kind of value proposition for the loft, even though the Embassy Suites probably has a better food and beverage package. It probably has a better offering as far as a product. It's a more full service property.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah. Now, and I like I can get into allergens and dietary needs, but I think those lofts and things like that are also stocking with food and beverage in those lobby refrigerators with dairy-free options or vegan options versus what you'll see in some of those other ones, which I can't eat at typically, or servers don't know.
You raise a really good point because you would think that so food and beverage has gotten very sophisticated, especially among these brands that are trying to streamline the whole operation, try to make it to where, hey, we'll serve quality, diverse ingredient, but in a low cost environment. So if that's, if we're only doing convection ovens, Citizen M's another great brand that just came out. Well, it's been out for a while, but they're
Which one?
Kind of Citizen M. It's an independent property from England or from the Netherlands. And they basically redefined what a real micro budget hotel room is and how the F&B plays into the overall concept of the hotel. And it's a 160 square foot tiny room. It's a micro hotel room. It has a king size bed in it. The bed is literally sandwiched between the walls. You can't walk around it. It's completely designed where you can't walk around it. It's just on one half of the room is the bed, and the other half is the bathrooms and toiletries and stuff. And it's got a space under the bed that you pull out. It's a drawer. You can put your suitcase there, and your suitcase is now the drawer. And it's got all these cool, fancy, fun lights in there. So it's a fun room to be in. You don't really want to be in there very long, and you really only want to be in there with yourself or intimately with somebody else. It's just not at all equipped for families, for example, nor is it equipped for two people who don't know each other. But they're getting rates that are well within, a more select or full service property, mainly because their F&B environment it's just very creative, and it only uses convection ovens. The person who serves you your liquor is probably the same person to check you in. So there's a cross contamination of employees there, which is, again, that's a cost saving measure. They're, as much as they can streamline, they've done. They have a limited menu, but it's very well thought out of each individual item. And so you have dietary restrictions that are covered in every item. And it's got a full bar, and it's got the entire environment is a fun party atmosphere. And there's about 4 properties in the U.S. open now, and there's going to be 10 more that are in the pipeline or so. And they're all in the urban core markets. So Boston, Miami, New York, L.A. Okay. So that's a concept, it would be an economy hotel, but it's not. And they're allowing F&B to drive that. So while the F&B may be at a loss, it certainly isn't from the rooms revenue perspective.
So how can convention hotels take that, or have you seen them take that food and beverage concept to up-level their service? Because...
right now we're seeing a genesis of what may be a transition. I do think smaller groups may be more the norm, or at least downsizing of group expectations. We're expecting smaller conventions and maybe even more focused conventions as to exactly what we're doing here. So a couple of things you're seeing in some of the kind of forefront of hospitality, whether it be New York or LA or whatever, is instead of just the standard ballroom in the basement, or a large exhibit hall, there's almost a focused use for that that room. And while maybe, on one level, we're trying to say, okay, well, how do we make the actual renting of the ballroom interesting? And well, maybe if we can build this property where the ballroom's not in the basement and maybe on the rooftop, that changes the whole dynamic, right? Or rather, instead of even doing a ballroom, why don't we just have a rooftop that sits and I'll use the Williamsburg hotels in Brooklyn as an example. Why don't we just have a rooftop amenity that's a bar that's fully sized to also be converted into an event space, because we also have a bar and restaurant on the first floor. And we'll just sell groups to that event all day long because there's sweeping views of downtown Manhattan across the river. What they're doing is they're pulling a lot of the local or even tech events that were from businesses that were usually in the Lower East Side or downtown or uptown in Manhattan. They're saying, well, we'll just book this event in Williamsburg because A, we get the great experience of the view, and it's a hip new hotel with a cool restaurant that our employees would like. So, those are kind of the seeds of what you're seeing is maybe the new experiential groups of meetings. Some of those properties also have very specialized rooms to kind of attract maybe meetings and events we never even thought about. One of them has a screening room for doing film screenings in, and that they rent that out. The Edition Times Square is another good example of having very unique group space. I hesitate to call them meeting rooms because they don't have a ballroom by any means, but they have a full theater on one of the floors, and they also have sort of studio type rooms. And for meeting planners, it's, well, what kind of experience does this group want? We can actually create something unique here that's different than just having the same ballroom experience, carpeted ballroom. And you're seeing some hotels then saying, well, we know that there's a demand here for maybe esports. That's another kind of potential growing of, well, how do we what does the meeting scene look like for this? So, but like I said, these are all in kind of the seed phase now. I don't think any of this stuff is truly the norm yet because everyone's kind of trying new things. It's where the dust will settle is kind of what we're going to determine. And I'm a little bit of I err on the side of caution. I'm saying, well, at the end of the day, a room is a room.
Right.
And selling that room and using it is just up to whatever the operator does or whatever the meeting planner needs. Whatever the needs of the demand versus the supply are, that room will accommodate over time. So if you've got a room that is, maybe it works really well as an art gallery, think of like the 21C Hotel, where basically You're having a venue, you're having a meeting in basically an art gallery. I mean, that's really cool, right? I'd rather have a meeting in an art gallery than just another carpeted ballroom space with circle designs on the carpet. So, but at the end of the day, it's still just a room, and there's nothing to stop that full service Marriott to just say, all right, we're going to take out this breakout space and we're going to make ourselves an entire, I don't know, just shooting something off the hip here, an entire spa meeting experience where everyone comes in and they actually all get a mass 50-person massage. Well, just trying to create some sort of new experience that drives a new meeting event to that location. So I think we're seeing green shoots of people trying to say, well, can we specialize certain rooms for certain events that are drawn because of the destination we have, whether it's, the screening room in Brooklyn makes a lot of sense because there's a large studio that films TV shows right next to all those properties. So it makes sense that you'd also maybe do a screening room if you've got access to facilities to do that. And while say in Philadelphia that, they're building a big esports arena, then it might make sense to have a little bit of an esports specialized with a lot of, aggressive AV equipment in the air support, maybe your own subset event with what's going on in the main event somewhere in downtown Philly. So those are all things that I think potential answers to the lag in F&B is maybe we just need to redefine what the new norms for meetings is. Right. And, I'm also of the opinion that there may be just some permanent losers here. It's just the whole market dynamics have shifted and we can't for sure say what's going to happen, but I do think a lot of the downtown urban cores that are reliant more on business travel are maybe at oversupply now. There's just almost too many events. The suburban ones, maybe not so much. So I don't know. I'm rambling. So
no, you're good. You're good. It's all interesting. I mean, you kept mentioning the theater, and it reminds me because AMC is now revamping itself and updating its technology in their movie theaters to rent out as space.
Yes.
And I've done an event in a movie theater in Atlanta. The AD equipment there was, it was a headache just trying to get the presentations up on the screen. And I think AMC is taking advantage of the same thing if that hotel downtown, in New York, up the screening room. So looking at it that way, I hope AMC is going to up-level their food and beverage versus just selling that popcorn and Skittles. But, I just come back to this meeting that I attended last year. I spoke at and attended, and the food and beverage was and it was a downtown convention center hotel, and it was just not good food. And, and the chef actually yelled at me because I was asking him why the sign that said gluten-free was over here and the sign that was the food was over here. And you didn't know if the signs went together.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, that's not my job. I tell them. And I'm like, he's like, I tell the front of the house. So I'm like,
when was
in June?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was like, okay. And so that brings in kind of a question. And I've talked to some executive chefs, hotel chefs before, is there a huge disconnect from the front of the house to the back of the house? Is that mending? Is that going to stay that way? Or is it because of a lack of staff, it's spreading apart?
I mean, the most successful food and beverage environments I've worked in when I was operating has always been driven from an experienced staff first, and it was the in and outs. I mean, you can get a hotshot server, banquet manager, whatever, but if they don't really truly know the inner workings of what the strength and the advantages and disadvantages the kitchen has, which a lot of times you just learn from the experience of being on property and knowing what the guests expect for each event or dining experience, whatever it is, that if you don't have that sort of institutional knowledge on property, then yeah, it's always going to be a headache and learning experience to make sure that these temporary or newer staff folks can get caught up to speed. And so if you've got meetings, especially, are driven by mostly outsourced labor. So if you're having a hard time having full staffed employees in the meeting space environment, then yeah, I mean, I could definitely see a disconnect between back of house and front of house there, especially when the chef is also probably doing 4 or 5 or 6 times more duties than they're used to.
Right. Yeah.
I was surprised the chef was even out there. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I don't think he was happy to come talk to me. So yeah.
No, I know. And again, a lot of the larger, big traditional, hotels, sometimes, when you're not getting that solid base of convention demand coming in and out, it's really hard to have a certain service standard that's maintaining. And so it'll be really interesting to see what happens with some of those properties and how they shift how service standards are done and whether or not, you change the way the food and beverage for meetings is. Rather right now, no one's changed. It's more all about keeping costs low as possible. So, and keeping prices high. I mean, prices are accelerating because they're trying to make that margin, that 30% profit margin.
Right. And I think you had said it was down to 27.7%, 28%.
Yeah. I mean, the way I translate that is evidently the operators are figuring out. They've gotten approaching where they're getting to what is probably pre-pandemic levels. Revenue still may be down overall. So the actual cash flow coming to the properties is still down, but at least they're managing the cost side of it. And that's both on, are we charging enough and are we staffing adequately but efficiently? So,
okay. I have one question, and I heard it to you beforehand, and you may have already kind of covered this, but food and beverage against RevPAR and then POR. So how does a hotel, for meeting planners' perspective, RevPAR is revenue per occupied room.
Available room. Yeah.
And then the other one is by occupied room. So do they base per occupied room?
So in the hotel universe, when we say RevPAR, we're referring to the overall hotel room revenue divided by the total number of rooms over a given period. And usually we're at my level, because I kind of look at everything from a 30,000 square foot level. I'm not on property anymore. So I'm now looking more at like larger trends. Generally that period would be over a year. So, I'd be looking at what is this hotel's RevPAR over a year, which basically is how well are they yielding their rooms inventory. Now ADR is the revenue per occupied room of hotels. And that's a way of saying how much basically on average are we charging for the rooms. Now, food and beverage revenue is a separate department, and rarely do you really compare it directly with the available rooms. It's usually directly tied to the occupied rooms. So if you're let's say you're a meeting planner and you're speaking with a sales associate on property and they're saying, look, we have to do this. There could be a directive or a budgeting issue where the GM is basically has to achieve a revenue in food and beverage is equal to, say, $120 per occupied room. So that means that they need to make sure that all of their revenues in food and beverage divided by the number of rooms over let's say a yearly period equals $120, for example. That's the way the sales associates may be looking at it, is to make sure, okay, well, if this group comes in, what does that do to that average? Does it bring it up? Does it bring it down? We can get this group in, and just on the rental of the event space, the food and catering costs, as well as what we anticipate maybe they would spend on site at breakfast and cafes and stuff like that. We are targeting for a room revenue of X, call it $150 for the room blocks, and then ideally $100 a day per occupied room. And then that way they're saying, okay, that's the target they're maybe trying to get. So it's a little, so you have to look at everything in relation to the rooms that are being sold, the hotel guest rooms, because I'm not really talking about a independent event center, right? I'm talking about a hotel.
Right.
A hotel is going to try to sell rooms first with F&B as the secondary option. So,
yeah. Okay. So there's one answer that you gave me on the questions I sent you before the show, was that in a negative example of a situation that negatively affected you. And I thought your answer was pretty unique in the fact that you said, this may sound petty or neurotic, but my least pleasant experience stemmed from the company I'm dining with rather than the establishment. I don't know who you hang out with.
So I was trying to, oh, that's hilarious. I was trying to come up with like a specific example. When you're someone who who started the operational side, you always see, well, I know why that failed. And you tend to be someone who kind of brushes off mistakes or whatnot. And because you just know at the end of the day, stuff just happens, and usually it's not out of pure purposeful intent, and it may not even be out of like incompetence. It's usually just like somebody didn't dot an I somewhere. So whatever, I was like, I had a lot of bad experiences like that, and I'm always like, at the end of the day, I could go back the next day and the restaurant will be fine, or the banquet will be fine. I mean, in fact, actually give one example of it had nothing to do with the food and beverage service. It was the hotel. So I went to a large hotel association meeting at this property that, it was about 300, 400 of us that showed up for a luncheon, and we had to park in a parking garage. And for some reason, we had to pay to get out, which was fine. But the thing is, they didn't have a mechanism on site to basically have us prepay and then just exit. Or they didn't put it into the package deal, for example, or whatever. And we were all paying per person to go. So it easily could have been an extra $10. So when we left the event, it took an hour to leave the parking garage. And this was like a lunch during the workday. This was back before work from home. So, I'm sitting there, and luckily I carpooled with 4 of my colleagues. And we're just sitting there like we're in this long line. We couldn't even back up into the line, and we're in this long line, and we're like, what is going on? So finally we get all the way down to the parking garage, and it's just this one guy just taking cash, card, whatever, not even a kiosk. It's like they just sort of, and I was like, that was one of the worst meeting planning experiences I've ever had, because it's like, the service was fine, the food was fine. It wasn't kind of what you said earlier. It wasn't anything to write home about. There wasn't like a great meal. And that's, unfortunately, that tends to be standard in banquets a lot of times. But that was like, it just completely soured the whole experience. Like the whole thing felt like a waste of time. And it felt like a huge error on the property's part of not, at that point, if I was running front desk like I've done before, if I was running the parking situation, I would have been like, get these people out of here. Right. Just open the gates.
Just wave them.
Like, forget about it. Forget about charging this nonsense, because we have guests trying to check in. They can't get in there. We have valet backed up. Valet can't get in. Like, this was a huge cluster F that was easily solved by somebody making an executive decision to say, get the cars out of here. I don't care. Right. So now when I say that usually it's the company I eat with. So usually it's when I have a awkward, bad experience with somebody that I eat with. And one of the biggest pet peeves of mine, if I go to a restaurant or whatever, it's different in banquets because you're all usually eating the same thing. But I hate going to a restaurant, and even if it's just like a diner, where it's just all the normal food that people expect. If the person next to me orders the same thing as me, it's almost like it's almost like I'm wearing the same dress as someone else at the wedding. It's like, okay, hold on. It's like, why are you ordering the same thing that I just ordered? Because then I'll go back and change my order. And it's just a weird neurotic thing I have. My wife makes fun of me. But it's like, no, we're at a restaurant to experience what they have. We're not both ordering the burger. Fine, I'm going to get something else because you just got the same thing I did or whatever. And it's hugely neurotic, but I don't know. It's a weird pet peeve of mine. So.
Well, I like it though too, because then you're experiencing more of the dishes and you can say, oh, let me taste that or whatever, right? It opens up something else in that sense if you're willing to share food.
Yeah, even if you're not willing to share food, I just sometimes want to see, like, what does it look like? What did they do? What did you order? That's cool.
Right.
What did you like? And I mean, I'm usually, it takes a long time for me to order because I have a hard time finding things I don't like. So usually I'm like, I don't know what I want to eat today, and I have to figure it out. And then if someone orders the same thing, I'm like, how could you order the same thing as me? It's like a weird personal affront. But
that's funny. Okay, so 2 final questions. Is there any industry standards that you think that are completely gone as a result of COVID?
Yeah, so I'm going to say there's probably not one that's completely gone. That's just not, there's always going to be some around. I do think room service is, even though there's a little bit of a rise of it during COVID because of health restrictions and things like that, at the end of the day, room service was just on its way out. And it still probably is. I don't think it'll ever completely go away in full service properties. You just can't really avoid it. I mean, as much as owners and operators would love to get rid of room service, I think room service is definitely on either a chopping block to get adjusted into where it's just you call down and go down and pick it up and bring it up, whatever it may be. The room service may be, especially unless it's like true luxury, then that's different because then that's an experience on itself. Right. And if we're just talking about a DoubleTree convention center, I wouldn't be surprised if eventually if they can, with brand standards, just completely get away from room service and then just have grab and go pickup. If you want
mini bars on that same note.
Mini bars is, again, it's been on the chopping block for years, and I would argue with COVID, maybe it was just exasperated because the idea of everyone being able to touch, because everyone touches what's in the mini bar, and now after COVID, it was all about minimizing touch points. So the mini bars were first ones to go, and nobody really wants to bring them back because they don't really generate a lot of revenue in and of itself. They used to, but the times have changed. People want to get drunk at the bar as opposed to in their room, and then maybe they'll finish in the room, but they'll want to at least go to the bar and have a social experience. So yeah, I think those kind of service points are probably the ones to most likely go away. And I do think that maybe the breakfast buffet is another challenge. I mean, big properties will still probably offer it, but I know that if you're a smaller convention hotel, you're not, or convention and small hotels is a misnomer. If you're a small hotel that has meeting space, maybe less than 200 rooms, and maybe you've got a 6,000 square foot ballroom, but kind of that's about it. So you definitely do conferences and whatnot. You may want to eventually just get rid of buffet breakfast and just either sell that as part of the group package that's in the group event room, and then for all your day-to-day transient guests, and transient guests are anyone that's just basically traveling by themselves or a small group of 2 or 3. And then your transient guests, well, they'll just do cook-to-order breakfast, which is, a little bit cheaper on the bottom line, and realize it does rely on a little bit more staff, but you can usually control food costs a lot better that way.
Okay.
So, yeah. So that I mean, and then grab and go is probably going to come back. So I think grab and go will probably get better over the time. I think the Mountain Bay traveler, the younger they get, the more they don't care about grab and go. I mean, I think that's true. I think the white tablecloth, white glove experience is just, it's not really as attractive anymore as it used to be.
Well, Noma closed, so, in the Netherlands, the high-end restaurant. Yeah. Okay, so my last question that I ask everybody is, what does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experience mean to you, look like to you?
So, locally sourced ingredients. I answered this, I think, on one of the preliminary questions, but I think really what it comes down to is how locally sourced your ingredients are. Especially meat. Honestly, meat can be very locally sourced in almost all areas of the country, this country at least. And so if you're selling meat products, then you should definitely look at sustainable practices as buying from your local farmer or rancher. Produce as much as you can. Obviously, you can't have salads in Maine during the winter, so you have to, buy, that stuff has to be shipped in. But generally, shifting your menu to accommodate seasonal changes, maybe more, pickled dishes, maybe more sides that have a slight pickling effect to them to make
I like that idea. Yeah.
be more appropriate. And then also I think a diverse environment. So there's a little bit of a challenge. I mean, menus are shrinking as a whole, as far as, people are focusing more on the menu, but I also think they're more diverse. So it's like, instead of like the options isn't like, what type of burger do you want? Well, at least you've got the burger, and then now you've got the Korean tacos, and then now you've got the very diverse assortment of food, but it's not in quantity. And so I think focusing less on quantity, more on quality and diversification of foods, and from a cultural perspective, from an allergy perspective, all of that can enable more accessible food and beverage environment. And I think sustainability is first and foremost, you've got to locally source as much product as you can.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much to everybody. Andrew is the Senior Vice President of CBR Hotels Advisory, which is a consulting company. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we talked about that up front. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll say it real fast. I'll give our elevator pitch. So CBRE is a huge, massive commercial real estate company that does all sorts of things. And I am a small fraction of that. We are the hotel specific space, and we do advisory work. We assist owners, operators, and in some cases, meeting planners, because for whatever reason, if someone just needs general advisory on what a potential hotel would operate, how it operate, assistance, and maybe operational guidance, mainly because we are industry experts that I say I'm an industry expert, but all of my expertise I learned from just asking actual hotel operators. So in fact, and I also interview a lot of meeting planners. So whoever's listening, I'm probably telling you things you already know, and that one of these days I'll end up calling one of you, asking about random questions in some market area or whatever. So yeah, I mean, we're just there to service and advise clients in all facets of hotel real estate, and whether that's building a hotel, concepting a hotel, or whether that's selecting operators and developers or whatnot. So it's a very all-encompassing facet of business.
Very cool. Well, and I just put your link to this website in the chat, so everybody knows where to get a hold of you. And he is on LinkedIn as well, so you can find him there. And I can put that up there if you want. See, copy.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you want to.
Link. Yeah, I can do that too. Oh man, and put that in there. Connect with him on LinkedIn because he is there and can help. So thank you, Andrew. It's been very enlightening, because planners need to understand the hotel side of business and vice versa. And so I appreciate you talking about it, and then how that food and beverage plays into the whole concept of a hotel design.
Yeah.
Right? Not just an event. So.
No, yeah. That's the one thing as a meeting planner, if I were to give any guidance, it would be that as you're talking to hotels and trying to book an event, at the end of the day, a hotel's primary goal, 9 out of 10 times, is to sell rooms. And that's the first thing. And that's where they would want to get the most revenue capture from your business, is out of the room side. So come to your negotiation tables armed with that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, everybody. It is almost an hour. Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate your time. And until next Wednesday, stay safe and eat well. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.